allowing me to welcome James tonight.
Great. Okay, so, yep, I'm James, MBA 2016. This is my second year. Are there any Americans in the crowd? Okay, awesome. Anybody else, if I'm using shorthand that doesn't make any sense to you, like you can't follow what I'm describing about the political system or something, just jump in. Just say that you're not following and you want clarification. Otherwise, it'll get very confusing very quickly. So, for me, I got into politics for a few different reasons. Part of it is specific to the kind of background that I had. So, my family was in the Foreign Service, which is the U.S. diplomatic service. And so we spent some time moving around. I grew up, I was a kid in Washington, D.C. We lived in Cairo. We went back to D.C. We lived in Berlin. We went back to D.C. I went to college in Baltimore. I spent some time in Beijing. I went back to the States. So I spent a good bit of time abroad, which gave me, certainly had a varied life, I guess you would say, a varied perspective on a lot of different issues. I would say that those two prongs of my life, my experiences in the States and then my experiences of the States while I was living abroad, sort of formed why I ended up getting into politics. Where I grew up, I grew up in D.C. What people say when they mean that, for those of you that know your geography, D.C. is a city, not a state. Maryland is to the north, Virginia is to the south. When people say D.C., they usually mean one of those two states. They mean Maryland or Virginia. I grew up in D.C. That's relevant in this case because I went to public school in D.C., and that informed a lot of what I saw and a lot of what I understood about the challenges that faced most Americans through my day-to-day life. So it was the kind of thing where D.C. was particularly hard hit by the crack epidemic. We ended up moving out of the neighborhood that we were living in. Right after we came back from Cairo, I was like 5 or 6. My brother and I, we went down to the park, and we came back, and we ran up to our mom. And we were like, "Hey, Mom, we found darts. We found darts." She was like, "That's really great. Put them right here by the door, because they're hypodermic needles, and then come on inside." So it was the kind of thing where that wasn't the world that I lived in, right? That was a world that existed around us. But it's also important to keep in mind that the neighborhood that I'm describing, where that happened, where there was severe drug abuse, where there were all the other issues that come with that, you could literally see the Capitol building and the Washington Monument and everything else like a few blocks away from where you'd be standing in that neighborhood. So things were not good. I went to public school in D.C. The public school system is desperately underserved. It certainly was the case when I was younger. It's changing quickly now, but there's still problems. I went to college in Baltimore. Anybody seen The Wire? Okay. Reasonably accurate. It doesn't give you the good bits of Baltimore, but it does give you a good picture of the problems that are facing Baltimore. So there's that. There's a lot of troubles in America's cities, and that was clear to me throughout my entire life. And so the trampling of minority rights and of the poor in the United States is something that was clear to me from a very young age. And just to sort of stress that point a little bit more, this is something that you might end up seeing this, for you first years, you might end up seeing this again. Great Gatsby curve is something that gets talked about a fair amount now. You probably know more about this than I do, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. The best way to look at it is that what you're seeing here is that there is more inequality. The more inequality there is in income, the more that translates to the next generation. And so that's perpetuating in America. Some people respond to this, they see it and they say, well, that doesn't mean that the American dream, by which we mean the idea that anybody can make it with hard work, anybody can move up in life, can make it with hard work. That doesn't mean that it's not real, it just means that it's harder. Not true. What is also happening is that it's getting harder and harder to give your kids the opportunities so that they can actually succeed through harder work. That to be able to excel to the next level of schooling, which also means that they would get to the next level of, which means that they would have access to better and better jobs. It gets harder and harder and harder to be able to do that. So that's a challenge that we face. I also grew up during a time of enormous tumult, I guess you could say, in foreign affairs. So just to give you a quick tour of the end of the 20th century, 89, 91, the Berlin Wall comes down, Americans are very comfortable. We think that, we've won the war of our fathers. We've beaten communism. We're good to go. We're finally living the dream. We're able to ignore things like the attack on the USS Cole, and we're pretending like, it's a one-off. Don't worry about that. 2001, towers come down. Everybody goes bananas because nothing like that has ever happened to us, and we start doing things that are atrocious. You'll have classmates. I certainly have classmates. I have friends back home whose occasionally their bodies and occasionally their sanity was corrupted in our pursuit of these wars, and that was horrific to watch happen. It was horrific to watch the march to war in Iraq that was built off of, I think it's fair to say, lies, and it was very that was a shaping moment for how I saw what could happen in our political process. So all of that bundled up with the fact that I grew up in DC, we saw the politicians up close, didn't want anything to do with it. And yet, Barack Obama comes on the scene, and second, probably only to my wife, Barack Obama changed my life. So his experience of growing up abroad, his experience of understanding what the United States, what the real promise of the United States is, what we mean to people around the world, what it means to live up to our ideals, what it means to see the devastation in our biggest cities. Man spent a lot of time as a community organizer in Chicago during a particularly troubled time there, if anybody's interested. At any rate, he comes on the scene, and you see that there's actually there's a lot of people that feel the same way, and that there is indeed an America that we can fight for. I was living in China at the time in Beijing, and people were getting ready for the Olympics. So seeing the kind of economic growth that was taking place there versus the great stuff that was happening thanks to our second try at supply side economics, which is really great and totally works and definitely doesn't destroy our cities, there was a sharp difference. At any rate, so I started campaigning. I went to Ohio, and then Mississippi, and then Indiana, and then Montana during the primary elections, and then I went back to Indiana. When you're running a campaign, am I doing okay on time? About halfway through? We're okay. When you're on a campaign, what that means is, think about it at a couple different levels. You have a local level where you're in a precinct or a town or a county, something like that. You're moving up, there's a statewide campaign, and then there's a national campaign. The national campaign is the thing that you follow the most easily. That's going to be in the New York Times, they're going to cover it in foreign newspapers. That's going to be things like who took pot shots at who, and what did they say, and how awesome was it when, the Donald Trump kind of sound bites. It's not a campaign. It's noise. It's noise for a lot of people, but nobody's minds are being changed by any of this. You're maintaining posturing. It's like when you go out and you see a bunch of guys and they're like, oh, hold me back, I'm going to fight him. It's like, you're not going to do anything. This is nonsense. You go to a state level and you're fighting more specific battles, right? You're talking about things that are mattering to people on a much more localized level. They're going to have concerns that are going to vary from state to state. For instance, Ohio and Indiana have been massively hit by, they have strong manufacturing bases that have eroded significantly for a variety of reasons that we don't have the time to talk about, versus a place like Montana, highly agrarian, but there's a growing educated class that's fueling tech ventures even in certain parts of the state. You're going to have a lot of varied concerns that people are going to be focusing on differently. You need to be targeting what you're talking about. When you go to a very, very local level, this is where you hear, has anybody heard the term organizing when it comes to campaign politics? This is the root level of all politics. It means that the organizer is a person that goes out. It's the same for labor organizing. You go out, you identify supporters, you train them how to go out and find more supporters and what to talk about, and they go out and they do that. You're building a network rapidly, right? That's the biggest piece of a campaign. If you want to win by, and in a lot of these places you need to win by single percentage points. It means that you need to identify and turn out your voters. That's what you're doing. This is backbreaking work. You're knocking door to door. You're talking to everybody that you can. You're getting these people that want to support your candidate to also go door to door knocking. Everybody's knocking. Everybody's on the phones. You're like a telemarketer and a door to door salesman, and it's occasionally soul crushing, but this is the meat of democracy, because you're actually talking to voters and you're getting people to go out and talk to people that they can actually convince. This is where people are being convinced about who to vote for. This is where actual discussions of policy are happening. I had more substantive conversations about policy and about differences in policy on doorsteps than I ever did with even friends when I was back in Washington, D.C., which is what I did after we won. We won in Indiana, first time Democrat won since 1964. So if you voted for Barack Obama in 2008, you're welcome. What I did, I went back home, and the place where I was able to find a job, I wanted to keep helping in any way that I can. So I worked for the Department of Energy. I built the daily briefing book for a guy named Stephen Chu. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes, great. For a guy named Stephen Chu. He won a Nobel Prize working on lasers. His idea of a detailed paper was hard. It was hard to match that. So that was pretty difficult work in the beginning. And then I worked on our policy and international affairs. I planned conferences all over the world and got to travel, including right before my wedding. I spent 2 weeks on the road with my boss talking about clean manufacturing in Turkey, and then international energy issues in India, and then we went to Singapore and Indonesia, and it was a whole thing. And ultimately, I still got married, so that was terrific. I also got to spend some time at the Council on Environmental Quality, which is at the White House. And there I interacted with interest groups and businesses. This is, again, a key part of what you do when you're working in politics, is that you're taking input from the outside. You're relaying the thoughts of the administration or of whomever it is that you're working for back. You're trying to find common ground. You're trying to build things that you can shape coalitions around certain ideas that have broad support. We're going to come back to that. And then I got to go back to the Department of Energy and do strategic planning for our new Secretary, Ernest Moniz. If anybody's been following the potential nuclear agreement with Iran, he was one of the key negotiators for that. He is far and away the coolest dude that I've ever worked for. There was one time that I was preparing, I was getting ready for him to arrive for a trip. He got in, the plane was delayed like 5-6 hours. They didn't get in until 2 in the morning. And we were like, what can we do? How can we make this better? What do you guys want when you land? And he was like, there's nothing you can do about it. It's weather. If you can get some Taco Bell and a couple of beers, that'd be great. We're like, okay, yeah, we can do that. Best guy I ever worked for. So all of this gave me a very specific perspective on politics and the political process and all of that. And for the Americans, what I'm really saying here is how I would want you to care about politics differently. And for others, this is about how you should be observing politics. If there are people in the room that genuinely don't care about politics, then you're presumably extremely bored by this point. Also, you should seriously care. Like, these are people that are making decisions that are going to affect you for the next 30, 50, for the rest of the time that you're alive. There's people that are going to be making decisions for you. You can be involved in that, or you can just toss it to the side. If you want to toss it to the side, then that's fine. That's less people that I have to work to convince, right? But you should probably get involved, because most of you probably care already for a lot of reasons. The climate is changing. There's a lot of questions about a nuclear Iran, as we talked about. ISIS, ISIL, depending on how, depending on your perspective. So-called state, that's another good one. There's a lot of issues. There's a lot of things worth caring about, and you should probably do that. Here's the thing. Does anybody know? Does anybody know the site Wait But Why? It's good fun. It's this guy, he goes out, he finds topics that he doesn't understand about, he drills down into them, and he just talks about them a lot. And he really investigates it. One thing that he talks about is this. Is this a perspective that a lot of you guys would agree with? Right. No. Incorrect. But let me tell you why. The perception here is that what you're getting into is that if you're in the middle, that you have a mix of these two perspectives, and the mix of the two perspectives is therefore rational, right? Because you're getting these people have a certain perspective and these people have a certain perspective, and you're closest to the center, so you're mixing those two ideas and you're good to go, right? And then there's these guys on the far side, and they're just crazy, right? Because they have ideas that are far outside of the mainstream. Ideas that are far outside of the mainstream could include specific ways that you should address sexual assault on campus. It could be things like revenue-neutral carbon taxes. These are extreme ideas. They're not held by the mainstream. That doesn't make them extreme. It makes them outside of the mainstream, but it's a question of how you evaluate that. So it's a lot more, don't think of these things as being a binary, or if you live in a multi-party system, don't think of these things as being on very set axes like that, and the closer to the center you are, the more it makes sense. Think of these things as a sphere. All of the issues that you care about are a sphere. And there are people near the center where you can start building coalitions because they're close to your beliefs. I would also, these are phrases that are going to be very, very familiar for a lot of Americans in the room and that may be familiar to other people. But this idea of, I'm a moderate, I'm an independent. This is my favorite one. I'm fiscally conservative, but I'm socially liberal, right? Both parties are the same. If everybody just voted rationally, things would be different. None of that is true. I'm moderate or independent. That's not actually a thing. Moderates, independents they have very specific voting patterns. They vote more in line with one party than would someone who loosely identifies with either party but doesn't really participate. So that's not really a thing. Both of the parties are the same, or all of the parties are pretty much the same, or offering that's just objectively not true. You cannot look at the policy proposals of parties in any democratic system and make that statement unless you live in like a dystopian oligarchy and there's only a state-sponsored opposition. And then you could probably make that statement. But unless that's the case, then that's not true and you should dissuade yourself from that. If everyone just voted rationally, things would be better. Rationality is defined by the observer. Just because someone isn't making a rational choice, there's a great book in American political science called Don't Think of an Elephant. And the idea is that it's about Kansas and the transformation of Kansas from being a Democratic state to being a Republican state. And the idea is that the Republicans were able to cause voters of Kansas to care about these identity issues and to scare them away from thinking about the things that were core to their economic values. They were able to get them to not think about their economic self-interest. Not true. They were voting very much in their self-interest. It's just that they define that differently than a political scientist who's basing that exclusively off of economics as being the sole point on which they should be voting. People are voting based on their perceived self-interest. You declaring that to not be rational isn't going to cause them to change their vote. Also, this thing, I don't really care about politics. Politicians only care about getting reelected. Totally irrelevant. Politicians are your instrument. These are the people that go out. They are your representative to get things done. Whether they do or don't want to get reelected is entirely besides the point. It's about the pressure that you as a citizen and as groups of citizens can bring to bear on them to cause them to vote in a couple of different ways. I'm gonna close this down real quick. Okay. Here are the things that I would recommend for you. One, rationality is defined by the observer, right? What's a rational conclusion? Consume as much media as you can from lots of different sides. I make a point of doing this and it makes my blood boil because I have a very specific viewpoint that's built by my very specific set of experiences that I told you about. And I told you about them so that you understand that I have a ton of biases when I come into given situations. So when people talk about cutting, state benefits to the poor, there might actually be a very valid reason there that can be backed up by data. I have a knee-jerk reaction against it, so I make a point of trying to read up on why they think it's a good idea. I don't like it, but that's sort of the cost of living in a democracy. I would really, really encourage you to get active with a political party, even just a candidate. Being involved in the democratic process, seeing what it takes, seeing the people that will sacrifice to bring change, whatever that might mean to you. You might be on a diametrically opposed point in the political process to me. That's fine. Participatory democracy is the point. Get in there, get involved, and care deeply about the outcome. When you are consuming your varied media, a lot of it will focus on tactics. So it'll focus a lot on Donald Trump said this, Donald Trump said this, Donald Trump said this. None of that is policy. It's all nonsense. What is he actually proposing? What are the costs? What do I think of the benefits? Do the benefits of this outweigh the costs? How does that compare to the other candidates? Not, Donald Trump is really targeting this group of people, and so he said this, and that's going to make them vote. None of that matters. You're focusing on the wrong thing. That's for the people running his campaign, and that's for party insiders. Once you're a party insider, get into that. Worry about the tactics. In the short term, worry about the impact that it's going to have in the country. Be receptive. That goes for life. That goes for everything. Allow yourself to be convinced if someone has a better argument. I'm happy to take any questions if people have them. Yeah.
So, I mean, you talked about how you got into it and why everyone should care, which is what I think was very convincing. But what made you step out of it?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, I think you saw that I don't spend a whole lot of time in one place, at least historically. When we left DC, that was the longest I'd ever lived in one place at one time. I've been there for about, going on 6 years. And so I started getting a little antsy, wanted to see what else was out there. Also, there's a lot of ways to be involved in politics. Working for a political party, working for a candidate, working in a government, all of those things, those are great ways of being very, very invested in the political process. Another way of being invested is by caring about these things, by talking to other people about them, by volunteering when you can. I volunteer when I go home for candidates, and by when you can, using your wallet in the American political process. That's a big part of it. And so there's a lot of ways to be involved in politics that don't mean that you have to work in it. So I didn't stop caring, but these stopped being the challenges that excited me on a day-to-day basis. That doesn't mean that it means that they faded into my number 2 spot as opposed to being my number 1. Yeah.
I'm American.
Hey.
What do you tell folks who are from countries that don't have a democratic system or don't have a system where people's beliefs, people's actions and discussions actually have an impact? How do you convince them to care about politics when really it feels like I could care and spend time on it and spend resources on it and it won't do anything?
Right.
And James, just to add on that, 'cause that was going to be my question. So at least for like my country or the countries where we come from in South America, where there's a lot of corruptions and politics are not people that you admire, and we still feel that we're surviving every government. How do you inspire that generation that is already super frustrated and get talented people to move into this?
Yeah. So 2 things. One, the other point is not just places where the political system is unattractive or where it feels like nothing changes, but the places where it's actively dangerous to be involved in politics, right? That's a totally different thing. So I was a teacher in China at one point in my life, and that was great because it also gave me, studying Chinese history and also being there and being able to talk with my students who were about my age at the time, was great because it gives you a totally different experience. Being involved in politics there is just a bad idea unless you have a very different approach to risk, right? And that can be the case in some places in Latin and South America, and all over the world you have problems of corruption where you have more and less functioning democracies, and there's a lot of very interesting analyses about where America falls on that scale, which are often very uncomfortable to read. But the point is that there's 2 things that in my mind have an impact here. One is overall education of the population. The more educated people there are, the less people that there are desperately just trying to survive day to day, and the more that you make that possible, means that there are more people that have time to thoughtfully engage with the political process. And so that's something that definitely raises it up. But that's also that also comes up with the idea that people do have to get involved, and it means that you can pick a limited scope, pick a specific issue, and this is going to be the thing that you care about. I care about the environment, or I care about labor reform in the mining sector, or something. This is going to be the thing that I focus on. I'm going to make this better, and then you work on that, you draw attention to that, and you start building out from there. And this is the way some people have been able to do it, the way that some activists have been able to do it. Every time that there is a seismic shift needed in our political process, which is often, that's the way that it always starts, is something very, very specific, and then you build out. Once you start building this new ground for assumptions and this new ground for what people can believe in. That's what I would suggest. For the countries where it's genuinely dangerous to be involved in the political process, or genuinely dangerous to be seen to be critical, that's a lot trickier. It's also a lot braver. I don't have specific recommendations there. That is way outside of my experience. Yeah.
Can I just ask, you said it was now your number 2 priority. What's your number 1 priority? What are you hoping to go on to do with your career?
Yeah, that's fair. So I got the constant changes that are taking place in energy production are fascinating to me. I got some familiarity with those when I was working in the government. I want to be able to work on those issues. The way that the private sector is occasionally leaping ahead of the public sector in its ability to deploy clean energy and its ability to generate power without the same reliance on fossil fuels or by making fossil fuels more efficient is super exciting. And that goes for virtually anybody that's working in the energy space. So that's something that I really like and something that I really care about. And if you guys are interested in learning more, there's an LBS Global Energy Summit I hear that'll be happening later.
The last question, please.
Hey.
Quick question. Especially at the national level, you vote, say, in democratic countries once in 4 years or 5 years. But you're talking about it to be a continuous process, right?
Yeah.
But the decision making is only once, or very few times. There's actually a dichotomy. Like there's this inherent mismatch there. What can be done to?
So it's so great. It's something that I totally wanted to talk about that I couldn't shoehorn into what I was talking about. So thank you so much for giving me a platform. The idea that you cast your vote and then you're done, that's the end of the process, right? And so every two years we have congressional elections, and then every 4 years we do a presidential, and it goes back and forth like that, right? And that's it. That's your whole interaction with the democratic system. Nope. The whole thing is that you continue interacting with that person that you helped elect or that you voted against, and you keep bringing to bear a network of people that are around you that care about similar issues, and you try to persuade constantly, and you try to build constantly new coalitions to bring to bear the issues that you care about. That's how the process works. So when you go home after that first Tuesday, after the first Monday in November, and you stop engaging with the political process, that's where the problem starts. You have to keep pressing, and you have to keep, and frankly, a lot of it is about being a squeaky wheel. That's the biggest part of it.
Sorry, may I just ask you one thing? I know that was the final
Yeah,
question. But
I'll
can
answer
you
quickly.
explain the lobbying groups,
Uh-huh.
and just because what you're explaining, it's like very optimistic.
Uh-huh.
But in the whole process, these lobbying groups that have money and power,
Uh-huh.
and they can buy anything and anyone.
Yeah.
Would you explain how they affect this, the politics of the day?
Yeah, for sure. So any group of citizens with access to capital can do that. They can become a lobbying group, and what that means is they go out and they put pressure on, they do exactly what I'm describing that people should do. They put pressure on elected representatives. My issue is less with the lobbying groups. A lot of the lobbyists actually have a valuable purpose that none of these representatives can be masters of every possible subject that they're going to be asked to vote on. And the lobbying groups from often opposite sides will come in to meet with that representative and try to give them their perspective. That's a valuable process. It's also a valuable representation of democracy in action. That's citizens bringing to bear certain thoughts. But what you're describing is that it can come to be dominated by people with more resources. Yes, that can totally happen. And that happens because, one, they have more money, but also because, frankly, not enough people are engaged. We have maybe half the country voting. Yeah, it's going to be real easy to sway people. Like if you write a big check in that kind of environment, it's going to be real easy to sway people. You get more of the country out there voting, you're going to have to spend a lot more money. It's going to become infeasible to simply sway elections with cash. So yeah, it's totally optimistic, but all of this is optimistic. I mean, we're governing ourselves. It's crazy.